Good afternoon. I'm Adam Levick, co-editor of Camera UK, and I'll be hosting today's webinar titled Plumbing the Depths, the Washington Post coverage of Israel, featuring my camera colleague, Sean Derns. Now, in his presentation, Sean will trace the historical shift in the Washington Post coverage of Israel from an outlet which once included a semblance of balance in their Middle East reporting to a paper that now arguably ranks amongst the worst in its institutional hostility towards the Jewish state, a pattern of bias that has only increased since the October 7th Hamas massacres. In his talk, Sean will cover these and give those that are watching a historical context of the Washington Post coverage, an analysis of current biases in reporting, as well as case studies from the Israel-Hamas war. And this will be followed by a Q&A session. Sean Derns is a research analyst for Camera and has master's in diplomatic history from the London School of Economics, where his thesis focused on U.S. foreign policy in the early Cold War era, Middle East. His writings have appeared in National Review, the Washington Examiner, the Washington Times, the Washington Free Beacon, the Jerusalem Post, Commentary Magazine, and elsewhere. Now, Sean has monitored both the Post coverage of both Israel-related issues, including anti-Semitism and terrorism, for over a decade. Many of his detailed critiques of the Post can be found at JNS, Allgemeiner, Washington Jewish Week, and on Camera's website. And those familiar with his work would also know he's a voracious reader of books on history and Middle East affairs, and his book reviews on those subjects are as illuminating and important as his op-eds and analyses. Now, before turning it over to Sean, I'll mention that Sean will talk for about 25 minutes or so, maybe a bit longer. And then, as I noted, there will be a Q&A. Now, you can begin typing your questions in the Q&A box below at any time during the talk. Now, turning it over to Sean.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you to all of our wonderful supporters for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here with you folks, even if the topic that we're talking about, the Washington Post coverage of Israel, is grim. There's been a noticeable shift in the Post reporting on the Jewish state in recent years, and we're here to talk about why and what we can do about it. Journalism, the late Philip Graham famously said, is the first rough draft of history. Graham made these remarks in 1963 while speaking in London to an assembled group of reporters working for Newsweek. The Graham family ran the Washington Post for years. Phil Graham himself was named publisher by his father-in-law, Eugene Meyer, who had purchased and revived what was then a failing paper in the 1930s. Graham, trained at Harvard Law School, had once been a law clerk for Felix Frankfurter, the famed Supreme Court justice and Zionist, who was a protege himself of noted legal theorist Louis Brandeis, arguably one of the founders of American Zionism. Philip Graham's daughter, Catherine Graham, known as Kitty, took over the Post in 1963 after her father's suicide. It would be under Kitty Graham's leadership that the paper would garner fame over its coverage of Watergate and other domestic political issues. Notably, the newspaper would also expand its international coverage, establishing more foreign bureaus, including in the Middle East. Fast forward 50 years to 2024, and the Washington Post is no longer engaged in authoring the first rough draft of history. Instead, the newspaper's brand of journalism differs little from what one would expect from a Hamas press release. Indeed, the current war in the Middle East has highlighted just how bad the Post's coverage of Israel and related issues has become. It's worth reviewing some of their worst offenses. One Post reporter referred to the well-documented cases of mass rape on October 7th by Hamas and other Gaza-based Iranian proxies as merely alleged. This reporter did so long after the evidence of those rapes were in the public domain. One Post story uncritically regurgitated claims by a Palestinian spokesperson that Israel was harvesting Palestinian organs, a literal blood libel that was repeated by a leading newspaper that professes to be concerned about anti-Semitism. The Post filed several stories that portrayed Israel as responsible for the death of Palestinian babies in Gaza. Again, another blood libel. These stories relied completely on anti-Israel sources with very little to no input from Israeli officials. Unsurprisingly, they were disproven, and the Post had to publish several lengthy corrections. Post columnists Karen Attea and Ishan Tharoor, among others, have accused Israel of genocide, overlooking the IDF's extensive efforts to prevent civilian casualties while engaged in urban combat, efforts that urban warfare expert John Spencer of West Point has called historic and unprecedented. Notably, Attea accused the Jewish state of genocide before Israel even responded. We'll talk more about her and Tharoor and specific and Post employees in short order here. Accusing the Jewish state of genocide meets the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism, not journalism, is now the Post's calling card. It's what's earned the newspaper the moniker of Al Jazeera on the Potomac, or as some pundits have it, the Hamas Post. This might seem excessive, but it's well deserved. Shortly after October 7th, which to be clear, and I think this bears repeating always, was the largest massacre of Jewish civilians since the Holocaust, Karen Attea liked and shared a tweet praising the attacks as, quote, decolonization. She later penned a column striking false equivalency between the Nazis of today and their victims. And to her everlasting shame and that of her employers, she all lives mattered the victims, acting as an apologist for a group that burns children alive. She warned that Israel was about to commit an atrocity by trying to deter Hamas from future attacks. She claimed Israel was wrong for trying to put an end to the genocidal terrorists who seek the Jewish state's destruction. Curiously, she failed to pen similar columns when the U.S. and its allies conducted their anti-ISIS campaign. It seems that the Jewish state alone is held to a different standard. She also failed to sufficiently highlight Hamas's extensive and well-documented use of human shields. Hamas uses hospitals and schools as headquarters and uses these civilian areas to launch and store weapons. In 2014, the Post previously noted that Hamas uses these locations, but that was another era and a very different Washington Post. Several of her colleagues, notably Ishan Tharoor and Shadi Hamid, have used similar rhetoric, accusing Israel of perpetrating a genocide and of being indiscriminate. All frequently fail to note Hamas's policy of using human shields. And in so doing, and I think this needs to be clear, they incentivize the genocidal terrorist group to continue to try and murder Jews while hiding in hospitals, schools, etc. Camera highlighted this in a Washington Times op-ed entitled, "Dear Media, Hamas couldn't do it without you," which I think accurately sums it up. The terror group needs useful idiots for their strategy to work, and the Post is happy to fill that role. The Post has even helped hide Hamas, literally. The newspaper cast doubt that Hamas was using Shifa Hospital in Gaza City as a main base, yet evidence of Hamas's use of Shifa has long been in the public domain. In 2014, the Washington Post itself noted that the hospital has, quote, become a de facto headquarters for Hamas leaders who could be seen in the hallways and offices. And as far back as 2006, PBS aired a documentary showing, quote, how gunmen roam the hospital, intimidate staff, and deny them access to protected locations within the building, end quote. Evidence of the hospital's dual use was helpfully compiled in a 2014 Tablet magazine essay entitled Top Secret Hamas Command Bunker in Gaza Revealed, and Why Reporters Won't Talk About It. Here we are a decade later, and they're still not talking about it. Additional evidence has emerged throughout the years, and U.S. intelligence has confirmed that Hamas was using Shifa as a primary staging ground. Yet during the recent war, the Post's self-styled Forensic Investigations Unit, led by Evan Hill and others, along with columnists like Tharoor, Attea, and Hamid, portrayed claims that Hamas was using Shifa and other hospitals as Israeli propaganda, contradicting the newspaper's own previous reporting. And while the newspaper treats claims by the IDF with undue skepticism, they are more than happy to regurgitate casualty claims made by Hamas, further playing into the terrorist group's strategy. Indeed, if there's anything that's characterized the Post coverage of the latest war, it's been their willingness, their insistence, actually, at repeating Hamas casualty stats. Across the board, the Post has insisted on doing so. And it's clear that this is an editorial decision. In an October 20th press conference, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told reporters, quote, I would not take anything that Hamas says at face value. I'm not sure anyone in this room would take at face value or report something that ISIS had said, and the same applies to Hamas. Similarly, President Biden initially noted that he had, quote, no confidence in figures effectively supplied by Hamas. Nor were they alone. October 24th, mere weeks after the war began, Luke Baker, formerly the Jerusalem bureau chief for Reuters, warned that Hamas has, quote, a clear propaganda incentive to inflate civilian casualties as much as possible. Baker also noted that the numbers that emerge from Gaza every day are, quote, simply not verifiable. Indeed, they are almost entirely uncheckable, he added, and the only source news organizations have for them is Hamas. Yet on November 1st, 2023, the Post designated fact checker Glenn Kessler rebuked Biden for his skepticism of Hamas-supplied casualty claims. Adam Taylor insisted in a Post analysis that the Hamas-run health ministry can sometimes be trusted with casualty counts, a curious standard that the Post doesn't apply to other Islamist terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They noted that both the UN and the State Department have cited Hamas figures in the past. This is poor journalism, and it's even worse logic. The UN's history of anti-Israel bias has been a matter of record for a decade. Indeed, the organization couldn't even condemn the October 7th massacre when given the chance. And members of the UN have even been caught on Hamas's payroll, and in recent days and weeks, it's been revealed that UN employees played a role in the October 7th attack. The Post knows better. As recently as May 2023, the newspaper published a letter from CAMRA entitled "Don't Trust Hamas." CAMRA noted that in a 2018 interview, Hamas official Mahmoud al-Zahar admitted to Al Jazeera that the group believed in deceiving the public for propaganda purposes. As CAMRA pointed out to the Post, trusting Hamas-run ministry to provide casualty counts is like trusting a fox to guard a henhouse. But the Post wants to be fooled, and it's perfectly willing to serve as a conduit for Hamas propaganda. That the Post published a so-called fact check, as well as an analysis defending trusting Hamas, speaks volumes, and it's resulted in some pretty poor journalism. The Post's faith in Hamas was on full display on May 27, 2024, an article entitled "Israeli Strikes on Rafah Zone Kill at Least 35, Gaza Officials Say." Those officials are Hamas, and unsurprisingly, they lied. The dispatch by Rachel Panet, with contributions from Neha Masih and Hajar Harb, claimed that Israeli strikes hit a makeshift camp within Block 2371, an area that was designated a humanitarian safe zone by Israeli officials on May 22nd, according to Mohammed Abu Hani, a civil defense official in the Gaza Strip. This served as the entire basis for the Post story, and it was reflected in its headline. But Mohammed Abu Hani isn't merely, quote, a civil defense official in the Gaza Strip. He's Hamas. And it turns out that trusting claims made by Hamas makes for some remarkably poor journalism. The entire story came undone within hours of it being filed. IDF Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner noted on Twitter, or now X, that on May 27th that the Israeli strike never took place in a designated humanitarian zone. Lerner pointed out that an aerial photograph of the point of the strike compared to the humanitarian zone showed as much. Further, he pointed out that Hani, a Hamas official, seemed to be the chief source for the story. The Washington Post, he added, should have checked this verifiable quote. But instead, the newspaper willingly quoted as fact Hamas lies about a strike that didn't occur in the humanitarian zone. The Post could have waited for an investigation. At the very least, they could have properly identified Hani or put his comments in quotes. Instead, the newspaper effectively served as part of a disinformation campaign from a U.S. designated terrorist group. As CAMRA warned years ago in a Daily Caller op-ed, Hamas uses human shields and the Washington Post. Within hours, the Post story came apart, but instead of owning up to their mistake and learning from it, the newspaper did a very revealing thing. They deleted the entire story. The Post didn't issue a public retraction or apology, nor did they append a correction. Both are standard practices in journalism. Instead, they just deleted the entire article and pretended it didn't exist. The Post's behavior is highly unethical, and it contravenes their own stated standards and ethics. But unfortunately, it isn't surprising. Indeed, one of the contributing journalists to the story, Hajar Harb, praised Hamas's October 7th terrorist attacks on her social media. CAMRA's Arabic department exposed numerous posts from Harb, in which the UK-based journalist celebrated the worst slaughter of Jewish civilians since the Holocaust. The newspaper was made aware of her posts, and CAMRA's work exposing Harb received international media attention. Yet the Post has chosen to keep relying on her, and presumably to keep paying her. That speaks volumes. In January 2023, CAMRA had highlighted the Post's decision to belatedly hire and expand their standards and ethics team, asking if it would lead to a new era of accountability. Well, that verdict is now in. Clearly, there are no standards or ethics at a newspaper that loudly crows about democracy dying in darkness and which pretends that its journalists are heroic truth tellers. They aren't. And the Washington Post is no longer a serious publication. The Post's atrocious journalism now detailed. The next question is, how did we get here? And when? The Post's reporting side of the house has never been great on Israel and related issues, including anti-Semitism and terrorism. They've published numerous problematic reports, replete with bias and misleading omissions. That's not a new feature, but if you think that the Post has gotten worse, and in significant ways, you're not imagining things. The Post's opinion side of the house used to feature commentators like the late Charles Krauthammer. Now it features Hamid, Ataya, Ishan Tharoor, and others. Further, the editorial board also used to be more fair towards Israel. Often a font of conventional wisdom, i.e. keep processing peace, keep reaching out to Palestinian terrorists who call for your direction, etc., but not overtly hostile. Yet today, the opinion side of the house, staffed by younger journalists, many of them woke, all of them steeped in ahistoricism and critical race theory, is very different. In this sense, the Post has fallen victim to what many of its competitors have. This is something that we see in newsrooms across the board. Younger journalists who are steeped in CRT and anti-Zionism and anti-Western ideology. but also journalists who see themselves as activists. These journalists view their jobs not as deciding the who, what, when, where, and what, why, and how, and just letting readers decide. Rather, they view their job as being, in effect, propaganda artists. They have a preconceived narrative, and they will omit key information, regurgitate propaganda from terrorist groups, etc., in service of that narrative. Relatedly, the Post has also fallen victim to another ill that we see in many newsrooms. There used to be a dividing line between the opinion side of the house and the reporting side of the house. This is no longer the case, and the net result is that those tasked with delivering news are, well, often delivering their opinions. Tharoor is a good example of this. His Worldviews column that he writes is manifestly opinion, yet it falls under the foreign desk and is thus part of the newsroom. This is a problem in other outlets, but it's perhaps more endemic at the Post than elsewhere. Now, I'm frequently asked, when did this change start to occur? Did it, some wonder, begin with the recent war, the election of Donald Trump in 2016, in which the paper took a very overt partisan role? Or did it begin with Jeff Bezos, who purchased the paper in 2013? It's difficult to offer a precise date. As I noted, some of these are issues that have been bubbling up to the surface of journalism writ large for 2 decades or so, at least. But I think 2013 is as good of a date as any to date the decline of the Post on this particular subject. It was roughly around this time that the newspaper began hiring many of the aforementioned columnists, although issues with the reporting side of the house didn't really exacerbate until later. But a noticeable deterioration did begin roughly a decade ago, and it's increased in recent years. In 2021, the newspaper hired Sally Busby as the executive editor. Busby came from the Associated Press and was head of the AP when it was credibly alleged to have been sharing office space with Hamas in Gaza. Under Busby, the deterioration that was already underway in terms of bias, lack of standards, etc., accelerated dramatically. The Post increased its investigations into Israel using splashy and expensive 3D graphics along with multiple bylines to examine context-free Israeli counter-terrorist raids. Indeed, the last 3 years have seen the worst impulses of the newspaper given free rein, leading to some of the egregious examples that I discussed earlier. In 2023, the Washington Post brought back its standards and ethics editors. The newspaper had previously eliminated the positions more than a decade before, but at this point they seem to be little more than fig leaves, judging by the errors and issues that have emerged during this war. On June 2nd, 2024, the Washington Post announced that Busby would be leaving, as she had overseen a period when America's second most storied newspaper had lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Matt Murray, who previously led the Wall Street Journal, was announced as the interim executive editor, and Robert Winnett, formerly with the UK's Telegraph, was initially announced as Murray's successor and taking over after the presidential election. Yet, according to reports by Puck, an outlet that focuses on the media, Busby and Post foreign editor Doug Joe ran a shadow campaign to discredit Winnett, leaking that he had paid sources, which is a not uncommon practice in UK journalism. Winnett, understandably, didn't want to take a job where the newsroom would be so hostile to him. Will Lewis, the Washington Post publisher, spoke with staff after Busby's departure. "We are losing large amounts of money," he reportedly said. "Your audience has halved in recent years. People are not reading your stuff, and I can't sugarcoat it anymore." In reply, he received complaints that the newspaper will now be run exclusively by white men, and defenses of the objectively failing reporting and opinion products that blame the very management, which has been spending some $77 million a year at the rate of subsidizing a massive loss. The Washington Post has made several attempts to staunch the bleeding, including cutting its Outlook section and offering mass buyouts for veteran staff. Lewis told the newsroom that the Post must, quote, "take decisive, urgent action to set us on a different path." Part of that action, he noted, will include setting up, quote, "a third newsroom, whose purpose," an internal memo said, "is to give millions of Americans who feel traditional news is not for them, but still want to be kept informed, compelling, exciting, and accurate news where they are and in the style that they want." This latter bit is key. The Post isn't focused on improving its reporting. Rather, it remains committed to delivering narrative-driven news aimed in, quote, "the style that they want." Some of the habits evidenced at the Post, a lack of impartiality, younger woke journalists who are indoctrinated in critical race theory, who are taking over newsrooms, they're seen elsewhere. Others, such as the blurring of reporting and opinion sections, are also taking place, but the Post is really leading the way on that shift. Yet the Post is pioneering another troubling trend in journalism. This newspaper has a remarkable number of journalists with ties to Qatari-linked entities, and this is noteworthy. Atea, previously mentioned, had served as the editor for the slain Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi dissident and Muslim Brotherhood supporter. It was revealed in a Friday news dump several years ago that the Qatar Foundation had been, quote, shaping Khashoggi's columns. No additional information was provided, and Atea has never answered whether she was aware of this or not. Notably, she also defended her decision to publish op-eds from the Houthis, a U.S. designated terrorist group whose motto includes "Curse the Jews and Death to Israel." But she was outraged when the New York Times published an op-ed by a sitting U.S. Senator, Tom Cotton. Nor is she alone. Shadi Hamid and other Post columnists spent years with Brookings, a DC think tank reliant on Qatari cash, and there are many, many others. Indeed, a recent investigation by Mark Lugas of Camera found no fewer than 16 former Al Jazeera employees who have worked for the Post. This includes everyone from Middle East editors to columnists to head of their forensics investigations unit, Evan Hill, graphics designers, video producers, reporters. Al Jazeera is, of course, Qatari state media, and Qatar is a chief backer of Hamas and other U.S. designated terror groups. Al Jazeera, to use a Washington Post phrase, is, quote, not traditional news. This is certainly an unusually high number, and it's attracted the attention of National Review, The Federalist, and other outlets. Now, when that footprint is expanded to include the numerous other entities with Qatari links, entities beyond just Al Jazeera, such as think tanks and journalism schools that receive Qatari money, the Post then has dozens of staffers with such links. Dozens. Notably, the Post's finances are opaque. It is owned by Nash Holdings LLC, Bezos' private investment company. Unlike some other media outlets, it is not public and not subject to certain disclosures. It is known, however, that the Post has previously published or disseminated issues of China Daily, which is CCP state propaganda, this presumably for money. But a broader point should be made here. Qatar has invested heavily in targeting Western media and Western universities. The Washington Post seems to be one of the places where this investment is paying off. I highly doubt, however, that it's the only one, and I think other outlets will have their own views change as former Al Jazeera, quote, journalists continue on in their career. So the first rough draft of history right now is looking awfully Orwellian. In this sense, Washington Post, failing as it might be, is a harbinger of what is to come. And it's a sign of why our work here is so important and why we need your support, whether it's through donations, boosting our educational and campus arms as they combat Qatari propaganda in schools, or joining our letter writing team so we can hold the media accountable. We need your support, and the recent war has highlighted just how important our mission is. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. I'm going to go right to questions because there are a lot of them. And a gentleman would like to know, and I'm going to try to paraphrase this. Why does the community approach, I guess he means, or she means, the pro-Israel or Jewish community approach this issue, meaning the problem with the Washington Post, as merely a crisis communication management problem and not as a highest priority geostrategic challenge?
That's a great question. That is a great question. I can't claim, of course, to speak for the broader community, but I will say there's been a long history of underestimating the role that media plays in warfare and in slandering the Jewish state and in propagating anti-Semitism. And there's a tendency in some quarters to maybe downplay this, overlook this. I just actually wrote a review for the Washington Free Beacon of Daniel Pipes' recent book called Israeli Victory. And one of the things that Pipes really highlights there is actually this does have a significant impact. Not just the media writ large, but the soft power attacks, if you will, on Israel. They play a role in Israel's ability to gain support abroad, its ability to form alliances, its ability to receive key munitions, as we see now with potentially with the UK. So I think there's always going to be some in certain quarters who don't want to rock the boat. I think proudly Camera does not fall into that category. So it's absolutely should be a priority. It's something that people really need to appreciate, that this really matters. And the Washington Post, failing as it is, which does not bother me one bit, is still able to have an impact. And it's important to counter the false narratives that they propagate.
Okay. Let me ask a quick follow-up question, just from my own experience. It seems like some Jewish pro-Israel or friendly organizations and individuals have woken up since October 7th as to the danger, the threat posed by media outlets which effectively have been pro-Hamas, including the Washington Post on my side of the ocean, the Guardian. So, do you agree that there's been some kind of people that have had aha moments since October 7th, or since the aftermath of October 7th, as well as some organizations, or are you more pessimistic?
Anytime someone brings up pessimism, that's kind of my nickname. Actually, to your point, I've had several conversations with some individuals who were perhaps, I don't want to say apathetic, but they weren't fully aware of the degree to which the threat had penetrated. I think that there is broader awareness post October 7th. Now, translating that awareness into action and being organized is, of course, a whole different ball game. I will say that the hour is late, and I'm glad to see that people are waking up. But these are problems, as I noted in my remarks, and as you well know, that they've been burgeoning for decades. And now here we are, August 1939. This is it. We're here. Post October 7th, there can no longer be the same sort of muddled thinking and, fear of rocking the boat. We just had the largest massacre of Jewish civilians since the Holocaust. And Israel is being surrounded snake-like by Iran and its proxies. And yes, we received initial outpourings of support in the United States and Europe and elsewhere, but at the end of the day, certain elements, certain countries seem to prefer dead Jews over living ones, and they don't really seem to recognize or appreciate the nature of the threat. So it's incumbent upon the Jewish community writ large to compel them to do so, the Jewish
Okay.
community and its allies.
Okay, thanks. Richard would like to know, is there anything short of mass subscription cancellation that could have any effect on the Post's coverage?
Great question. I really think that the affecting a newspaper's bottom line is the best way to get their attention. In the past, the Post has received pressure and community organized boycotts. This is years ago, over a decade ago. I do think things like that can potentially be effective. At the end of the day, the bottom line is what matters, and that's what they're paying attention to. And if Jeff Bezos sees, geez, this is not proving out to be a great little investment, and we already saw with when they tried to announce Winnet as being a successor and the blowback that was organized against him, the newsroom is fully woke. And this includes the editors and the standards and ethics people. I mean, I guess they have them. I guess they exist. They don't really seem to be doing their jobs. So I think that the best way is to affect a newspaper's bottom line. Letters to the editor do matter. So joining our letter writing team absolutely matters. And, really calling them out for what they're doing. I think that's the other thing. Certain outlets, you have editors and reporters that can be maybe persuaded to be held to a higher standards of ethics. They're not necessarily narrative driven. They maybe just might not be aware of all the facts or some of the issues with the reporting. And you can kind of highlight how they can, be a better journalist when it comes to covering the Middle East. I don't think that that's where the Washington Post is at. I think naming and shaming them right now is the best thing that can be done. So that's why we had a mobile billboard that was driven around Post headquarters, highlighting the Post's decision to continually regurgitate Hamas casualty claims. I think things like that are very effective because the Washington Post has deprived itself of being a credible newspaper, and more people need to be aware that they've self-discredited. So I think
Right.
that is the most effective thing that can be done: naming and shaming and affecting their bottom line. This is not certain journalists are good faith actors, and certain outlets are good faith outlets. I don't think that's where the Washington Post is at today.
Okay. And that brings me to another question. Jane wants to know who owns the paper now, and that, of course, is Jeff Bezos. So my question, picking up on Jane's question, is, I mean, Bezos can absorb a big loss, right? So I'm assuming that he has no financial incentive to necessarily do anything to change course. So doesn't that kind of make them immune from the usual market demands that would be pressure upon them to turn the ship around rather than continue to lose money?
To some extent, perhaps. But at the end of the day, everybody really cares about their bottom line. And I think that, and also further, like, do you really want to be associated with a newspaper that
Hmm.
denies mass rape by Hamas, that engages in blood libels, that treats Hamas officials like they're, high priests and should be uncritically quoted and cited?
Right.
Uh, that's a decision. I mean, some people have chosen to associate themselves with that. I don't think that's either for one's legacy or one's bottom line the best decision to do so. So I really think that what we saw with this recent turnover at the newspaper, even if the younger woke journalists aren't aware of it, is a sign of what's inevitable. What's inevitable, And also, if you look at the Post's history, I should add, they go through these boom and bust periods. And this even before the huge change in journalism with the rise of digital and the drop off in print. This is just something that the Post isn't exceptional in that either. Other newspapers are like this. They go through boom and bust periods where they change owners, And in 2013, when Bezos took over, the Post wasn't doing so well either. I think that they got a big bump in 2016, 2017 with the election of Trump that improved their coverage because they made it all about him and that became their business model. I don't know if that's necessarily a sustainable business model. So we will see what happens going forward. But I think that what happened with Busby's departure and the uproar that followed is a sign of other things to come. It's just a matter of when.
Okay. Aletta would like to know if Jennifer Rubin has been speaking up on behalf of Israel at all, or additionally, has anyone there have?
So, it's always the Post is a massive newspaper. It's huge. And they have way more employees than they should. And I can think of some that probably shouldn't be there. But anytime you have an organization that's that large, you are going to have people that are, and I'm speaking in very broad terms throughout this webinar. There are good reporters and there are good, editors, et cetera. There are good people at the Post. It's a massive entity. As far as speaking up about Israel, not really. There's been a couple columns here and there. Henry Olsen, who's not with the Post but has written columns for them, has published some good things. There have been a few others, but writ large, I would say you're talking like 9-1. Not a lot, and certainly not enough. And I think the real issue is just everything bleeding onto the reporting side. You have them echoing each other, and this citing of Hamas casualty claims as if they're fact. And for the reporting side of the house to do that as well, it's particularly egregious. So unfortunately, not really, couple columns here and there writ large. No. Jen Rubin. I don't know who reads Jen Rubin these days. I'm not sure, but can't really, not that I'm aware of.
Okay. James would like to know if anyone at camera has written rebuttals to the Post's so-called forensic analyses of alleged IDF atrocities.
Yes, I have. At JNS and at Algemeiner and on our site, and I believe I've also cited them in a Washington Times piece or two. These are really problematic reports, and we first started to see this a couple of years ago. Again, I think more or less along the time that Busby came around, maybe a little bit before, but it certainly preceded the current war. And that is, I think, a really revealing thing to look at because these are splashy investigations, as I noted. They have multiple bylines. You're talking 4, 5, 6 reporters, graphics editors, all sorts of people. They're going all in on this. And this is a paper that's broke. They're losing money. And they're spending all this on splashy 3D graphics with multiple reporters to highlight Israeli counter-terrorist raids in the West Bank. Geez, that's really a curious and selective interest. And then when you look at some of those reporters, including the head of their forensic investigations unit, Evan Hill, our former Al Jazeera, he was actually based in Doha for a while. Geez, I don't know. That kind of stands out to me. So, you have a paper that's bleeding resources, and this is what they're focusing on with that amount of money. I mean, that number of bylines, 3D graphics, a lot of words, a lot of pictures. This is a priority for them. And I think
Right.
I think that's very telling.
Roseanne would like to know, this is a good to follow up on what you spoke about. How do we get Qatari money out of the media and higher education, legally or otherwise?
Well, that is a fantastic question. I can't speak to the legal. I'm not a lawyer. There are people at camera that are, but that is not my area of expertise. And nor can I necessarily speak to the educational side of things. That is also, again, the part of our education and campus arms. But I will say that there needs to be a broader shift in the United States regarding Qatar. Qatar, their status was upgraded 2 years ago to a major non-NATO ally status, which is absurd. It is absolutely absurd. Qatar supports U.S. designated terrorist groups. That's not up for debate. It's a fact, and they do not act in America's interest. This is well known, but they have a lot of money. They don't have any ethics or any morals, but they've got a lot of money, and they're willing to throw it around. And so we see the results of that either at universities or as it bleeds down into media. But I think there needs to be a broader shift regarding Qatar. There are several allies that I think, and I've written about this as well, that really we need to raise questions as to just how, are they really America's allies? I mean, you have Qatar sitting there. There's a U.S. air base right there, and you have members of U.S. designated terrorist groups that have killed Americans, killed and kidnapped Americans, and of course Israelis and others, sitting mere miles from a U.S. air base. So something's wrong here. And if you're looking at the last 20 years of the global war on terror, and you're looking at this, I think few things better encapsulate our failure in the global war on terror. That here we are, we have an American air base, and which, by the way, they've leveraged against us, but which really we should be leveraging against them. What does Qatar have? They've got universities and media arms. You know, how many divisions does Qatar have? None. So you know, as Stalin famously said of the Pope. So I think that we need to really change how we look at Qatar. They're not an ally, and they're a huge problem. And they've been very successful because we've been naive, and we have been on autopilot. And so now we're reaping those rewards.
Okay, thanks. Eric Rosenman would like to know if accountability is to woke journalists as outmoded as objectivity and balance. How can outlets such as the Washington Post be held to any traditional reporting standards?
Great question from Eric, who is a dear friend and a great writer. I recommend everyone check out his writings. That is, you know, I really think that you look at all of the institutions that we have. I think there's a general perception here writ large that a lot of our institutions are just not doing great in this country. I don't think anything has failed as badly as the fourth estate. And I'm not going to go into other examples that go past camera's purview and that don't deal with the Middle East, but the lack of quality coverage, the lack of standards, the lack of ethics is just so astounding. I mean, I'll tell you a story that Eric told me years ago himself. He knew someone in a local newspaper in Ohio that wanted to put out, who was a reporter, and he wanted to put out a sign in his front yard for a member, for a friend of his who was running for school board, just school board, nonpartisan position. He was told by the editor of that paper that if he put out that sign, he'd be fired. So just clear-cut signs of ethical behavior that we saw 30, 40 years ago in newsrooms, they don't exist. They don't exist. In some places, maybe, sure, kind of. At the Washington Post, absolutely not. So I think, you know, as I was saying earlier, you have certain outlets where you can work with reporters, you can work with editors. Sometimes they just don't know. You can educate them. You can highlight errors in their coverage, and it's all in good faith. And then you have people that are not acting in good faith. And I think that right now is unequivocally the Washington Post. Again, I'm speaking in generalities. There's good folks there, of course, but you know, regarding their coverage of Israel, regarding their coverage of related issues to include terrorism and anti-Semitism, it's pathetic.
But to follow up on Eric's question, I mean, I guess you would agree just based on your response, but maybe you can expand a little more. This epistemological relativism, this belief that there's no such thing as objective truth, would you say that is a factor that corrupts, morally corrupts, and ethically corrupts the Washington Post and other media outlets in a way that makes it really hard to affect any sort of real change?
100%. And I think even beyond the media, I think it's socially corrosive.
Yeah.
You know, and this is, unfortunately, this is what we're contending with today. And this is why, you know, our arms that we have on campus or education institute, this is why also they're so important, because the people in these universities and these schools, they're future journalists, they're future academics, and they're being taught moral relativism. They're being taught to excuse and apologize for terror. And then they go off and they become a reporter, and, you know, maybe one day end up as executive editor at the Washington Post and can share office space with Hamas. So I think that this is kind of where, you know, everything's bled down the last couple decades. And maybe we've seen the crescendo of where that's at, maybe not yet. But if you're dealing with bad faith actors, I think it's really, really important not to give them any benefit of doubt, and don't give them any good faith, because they don't deserve it.
Okay. Thomas would like to know, given that anti-Israel bias permeates the media, how does Fox News rank among those presenting the truth relative to Israel?
So I don't follow Fox News.
Mhm.
Basically everyone gets certain outlets, as you know. Adam is been given the Guardian among others, so you can all feel really bad for Adam. But I deal with 16 different news outlets, and Fox News isn't one of them. So I can't really speak to their coverage. I've of course have seen occasional reports and so on and so forth. But I can only speak to the outlets that I monitor regularly. But I will say
Yeah.
this also. One thing that is telling is whether a news outlet will publish your opinion pieces or not. And I
Mm.
wrote a piece years ago on the UN's anti-Israel bias and how media outlets should not be treating the UN as a uncritical, or they shouldn't be treating them uncritically. That they're their biased actor. And Fox News ran the piece, was happy to run it. And since, of course, that's borne out, there's been numerous UN employees that murdered Jews on October 7th. By contrast, the Washington Post will not run our pieces. So
Okay.
that is a sign that I take it. If a news outlet is willing to publish views, even if they're views that they don't agree with, okay, that says something about the news outlet. If they're not and they're just uniformly ideological, well, that also says something.
Yeah. Okay. Eric would like to know, he says, unfortunately, you can make the same statements about CBS TV News, Haaretz, the LA Times, etc. Would you blame this on the lack of priority that Israel has made to fight the horrible reporting? Now, I'm just going to add my own voice. This is a question I get a lot. What can Israel do better than it's currently doing to fight the cognitive war against it alongside of the military war? I have thoughts about that, but I'd like to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so when I started really doing this over a decade ago, I was initially my assessment of what the Israelis could do was perhaps a bit harsher. So I thought, well, geez, Israel, there's the old saying, Israel's not good at PR. They're not good at getting their narrative out and so on. There might be some truth to that, and I think in certain instances that's the case. And I'm not saying that they're, you know, infallible. Uh, but I think that really what I've come to believe is that what we see with the media bias is really it's reflective of anti-Semitism, pure, plain and simple. So can Israel do better? Sure, but Israel is and I think Netanyahu said this once before. They're the Jew among the nations. So it's the fact they're starting on their back heel effectively
Mhm.
because the whole world gangs up against the Jews, and in this case the Jewish state, to put it bluntly. So my assessment is less harsh of Israeli PR and media arms and so on than it used to be. I think really, and we see this post October 7th. If you just look at the absolute horrors that occurred, and I don't need to tell you, Adam. I mean, you live in Israel. I don't. Occurred on October. I mean, just on the footage that I saw. I mean, unbelievable, horrific, haunting things.
Mhm.
People being burned alive. Large massacre, large mass rape. And the world said, geez, this is awful. How horrible. 2 weeks later, okay, well, Israel's awful. So, I mean, with sustaining casualties that, are multiple times what the United States sustained on 9/11. And how sympathetic is the world less than a year later? Not particularly sympathetic. So I think that that's revealing of a lot of things. And I think that that carries over into how the media covers Israel. So it's always going to be a fight. And I think that that's just because Israel's the Jewish state. So I think at its core, it's about anti-Semitism. Sorry for being so long-winded, but that's
No, no. In fact, I've always said that if Israel had the best PR in the world, it wouldn't have as much of an impact as people think. So, all right. Now, Stuart wants to know: does the Washington Post have an undue influence on government policymakers regarding Israel? And I'll just add, in monitoring the British media, for instance, the BBC has a huge impact. It's not just it's a global outlet. They are taken as gospel by government officials, by policymakers, by politicians. Does in the day of a diversification of media with Substack, with social media, does the Washington Post still have the impact on Washington policymakers that it used to have?
no, no, I don't think so. I think they like to think they do. And there'll always be segments of society that are big on brands, and you're always going to have people that are going to say, "Oh yeah, Post is great," and the Post is Watergate, Watergate. Well, Watergate, was 12 years before I was born. It's been a
Right.
bit. Richard
Right.
Nixon dead for 3 decades this year. Time to get some new stuff. So No, I don't think so. I think that when it comes to what influences people on the Hill, I would even say Politico, which also has tons of issues, Axios, The Hill, those sorts of
Mhm.
publications are perhaps more influential. I think there is a broader sense on the Hill. And really, I should note too, to be influential, you have to be perceived to be truly influential. You have to be perceived as being not unbiased, but not overtly partisan, right?
Mhm.
Every paper has ideological biases. Okay, fine. But if you really want to have an influence, you can't be seen as overtly partisan. And that's the category that the Post has chosen to put itself in the last 10 years. So I think that their influence extends, I mean, I'm sure, the Hamas caucus and Rashida Tlaib and others read the Post. Maybe they'll write for them one day as columnists. But no, I don't think that they're particularly influential. Not considering how big of a staff and budget they have. I'm not saying they're not influential, but they're not as influential as they should be, perhaps, or could be.
Okay. Danielle wants to know, she says, I'm a Washington Post subscriber. What can I do to put pressure on the Post? If I cancel my subscription, what other news outlet do you recommend? I live in the DC area.
Great question. So, I'm often asked this too. What news outlet do you recommend? I can't say I recommend a single one. I read as much as possible from as many
Mhm.
outlets as possible and try and decipher the truth from there because almost every outlet has issues. They've got, problematic reporters or, great reporters too, of course. So I couldn't say that I'd recommend a single specific one. I will say, and I have people tell me that, oh, they canceled. I've actually had a lot of people tell me that they've canceled their subscriptions to the Post after October 7th and the Post's egregious coverage. If and I always tell them, if you do that, if you just cancel and you don't tell them why, it's not having the impact that you should. So if because they need to know what they need to fix, and if you just cancel, that could mean a million and one things. So I'll take that for what it's worth. But there's a multitude of other outlets, and it's so tough these days, and this is why cameras around to try
Okay.
and get the truth because there's a lot of problematic media outlets, and it takes a lot of work. Ironically, because we're in an area where there is a diversification of news, or an era, I should say, of diversification of news, and it takes a lot of work to get at the truth.
Yeah. I would just add that I think Substack is a great new avenue for people that you could subscribe to individual journalists who you respect and whose journalism is sound and fact checked and kind of bypass the major media outlets. So I think the diversification of media is kind of one of the things that makes me a little optimistic that at least people have greater access to a greater variety of views if they choose to pay for the subscription, of course.
I'm going to strike a rare optimistic note and agree with you. I think that I agree. And one of the nice things about things like Substack is you can get someone who is, an actual expert on a particular subject and be able to really dial into that subject because this is all that reporter might write about and research. And free of the sort of no, there's no necessarily, sometimes there's no editor hanging over saying you can't write that about this person,
Right.
or no, let's quote Hamas here. So yeah, I
Okay.
agree.
All right, two questions about Bezos. Just I know you touched on him, but has anyone approached him as far as you know? And just you mentioned that even if he doesn't care about losing money, that he cares about his reputation. Do you know if anyone or any group has approached him and said, "Hey, you're really making a mess of this"?
Not that I'm aware of. If Jeff Bezos wants to have me over for dinner, I'd be happy to sit there and chat with him. Uh,
Okay.
it would be an interesting dinner. No,
Yeah.
not that I'm aware of. I would assume that I would like to think that maybe they have because I think people have really woken up. Cameron's been writing about how bad the Washington Post is for years. But
Right.
since October 7th, it's gotten a lot more attention from a lot of other outlets, Jewish Insider, National Review, and others. These are systemic and endemic issues with the Post. And I think people have finally woken up to how bad they are because October 7th, took the mask off.
Right. That's a good way of putting it. I know that you don't monitor the New York Times, but Deb wants to know: is the New York Times much better than the Washington Post?
Yeah, be reluctant. My colleagues that monitor the New York Times, Gilad Any, Ricky Hollander, and others, they'd probably have better thoughts on the Times. But one thing I will say that the New York Times does do, the Washington Post doesn't really do, is there are more detailed reports. The level of reporting is more granular, not necessarily on Israel specific, but on the Middle East, it is. what comes out of the Washington Post is just, it's really, really, really superficial. If you know anything about what's really going on in the region or elsewhere, I mean, it is supremely superficial. And I think there's a level of granularity, and this is a Washington, D.C. watchword at the moment, granular, that you can get in the New York Times sometimes, that you don't get in the Washington Post. But, you know, the New York Times is also really terrible. It's not, you know, it's not the, maybe it's not the Guardian. I wouldn't say the Post is the Guardian. To me, the Guardian is like the supreme example of what not to be. But
Exactly.
I think that you know, I think that's the big difference. You could, I'm going to be really crass here. You could have a lobotomy and craft a Washington Post column. I mean, they're just extremely superficial.
Yeah.
They are.
Yeah. All right. Sharon wants to know, I don't know if it's true, but Sharon says that recent editors had their background in the British media. Has that been a source of the bias?
Good question. You know, perhaps there. So when I started with camera, there was William Booth, who was, I don't believe he's British, though he was in Britain. Then there was Loveday Morris briefly, who was British. I don't think so necessarily. It really kind of maybe depends on the background. I mean, if they came from the Guardian, if someone's bio says Guardian, you know, that's a huge red flag to me. It's like someone saying, you know, I used to work for Al Jazeera / Hamas or whatever. It's pretty bad. So no, no.
Okay. Jonathan wants to know if members of the Washington, D.C. community wish to set up a meeting with senior Washington Post leadership. Who specifically at the Post would Sean suggest be included in such a meeting?
Good question. What I will say is we've had those meetings in the past, and we've had them, some of which were productive, some of which weren't. Most of them consisted of them sitting there listening to concerns, and in some cases we would see some improvement. It would be temporary at best, and in some cases we wouldn't. A lot of the people that I used to have meetings with are no longer there, so this is also part of the issue with the Post, is because of all the financial situation, and otherwise there's been a lot of upheaval, a lot of turnover. People that have been with the Post for decades are now gone. I would say, going back to my earlier comment about good faith actors, that, you know, you're not dealing with good faith actors here. I think as high up as a person as you can get, and it would have to be, you know, you'd really have to emphasize the grassroots aspect to get their attention, because they are also concerned, you know, contradicting what I just said a minute ago. They are concerned, of course, about their bleeding numbers, clearly. So if they have organized members of the community showing up saying we have real huge problems, I would want that such a meeting to be with somebody above a Middle East editor. I mean, a foreign editor or higher. So the biggest fish you could get, that would be my advice there.
Okay. We're running short on time and there's a lot of great questions. So let me just try to ask this. Stuart wants to know if the Washington Post demonization of Israel in and of itself constitutes anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Okay. All right. All right. This is interesting. Dale says, can you touch upon fact checking? I'm a professional fact checker who works for major international publications. Believe me, he says, my work opportunities have dwindled because fact checking has been cut or given to interns who lack experience and expertise. What role has that had in what we're seeing now at the WAPA, at Washington Post and elsewhere?
So yeah, that's a you know, a great question, and also a great point. As we've seen the downsizing of newsrooms, you've seen positions like fact checkers, copy editors, these positions get eliminated, and it shows. It shows. You not only do you see things getting in there that were clearly not fact checked, but you also see a variety of other. You see headlines that would have never appeared. I mean, Eric, Mr. Roseman, who is former newspaperman, said, you know, you should never have a headline that's more than 7 words, and I think that's another good example. You look at some of the headlines in the Washington Post or other major newspapers, and they run on and on and on. So the lack of copy editing, I think there's one of the things that having print did do is it made journalists and others be disciplined. And with digital, it's a lot more free form. There's a lot less discipline. You can go in and you can just delete something. You can delete an entire story, as I discussed. So I think that that's another issue that's been emerging in journalism over the last couple decades with the rise of digital and with huge transformations in the media environment.
Okay. A lot of questions about what they can do, what people, concerned citizens can do to support Camera's mission and more broadly to fight anti-Israel bias in the media. Can you give a list of the few top things that people can do?
Sure. Make sure you're actually a Camera supporter. Make sure you get our emails, our weekly updates. Join our letter writing team. They do have an impact. I've spoken with numerous reporters and editors that say, geez, we really can't stand having our inbox flooded with you folks. So those are some good baseline things. Support Camera. We're a small but mighty organization. You know, we're not the size of some of our other compatriots, and we do, I think, punch way above our weight. So those are all good basic things. In terms of don't be afraid, to the earlier question, don't be afraid to reach out to reporters or editors, and don't be afraid to try and get meetings, especially when it comes to, like, with the Washington Post. Don't be overly optimistic here. They do have a narrative, as I've highlighted, and they've got something that they're doing. But if they're worried about mass cancellations and bleeding more money, and you can say, geez, there's 50 of us here, we're organized as a community, I do think that has an impact.
Okay.
As I mentioned, I met so many people that said, I canceled my subscription to Washington Post after October 7th. And then they tell me they didn't tell anyone why. Well, that's good. But the newspaper needs to know, they need to be able to correct their failings.
Okay. Maybe one or two more questions. Sheila wants to know, just as our schools of journalism are turning out activists, our schools of education are turning out K through 12 teachers who are marinated in ideologies such as CRT, and including explicit anti-Semitism. How can we as a society combat that problem?
That is a fantastic question. And that, I think, is
Yeah.
really that's the $1 trillion question. I don't know. I think that, anything that happens that's good starts at grassroots, and it starts at, recognizing that someone else isn't going to do it for you. You have to step up. If this stuff is in your schools, if this is what your kids or grandkids are learning, don't expect, absolutely reach out to Camera, reach out, but you have to play a role. You have to play a role. You have to be an active and involved citizen, and whatever it is. Write letters to the editor. Reach out to your legislators about whatever the issue is that you're concerned with. Reach out to newspaper editors. You have to be an active citizen. You can't be apathetic. And I think that is something that, unfortunately, is why we are where we are at today. It's just a level of apathy, and things have just decayed and degraded over the last several decades. And now here we are, with the long march, Mao's long march through the institutions having been successful, and critical race theory dominates. And we see the effects of that, not just with anti-Semitism, but in a variety of other professions beyond journalism.
Let me mention also, I think you mentioned this, but I want to just repeat that Camera has an education institute that is trying to tackle the problem of anti-Israel bias and anti-Semitism in K through 12 curriculum. So I would recommend people who are interested in that to check out that tab on our homepage. One more question, if I can, and that is, or at least let's just paraphrase it into social media. How important is social media? I know Camera has active social media presence within Twitter, X, Instagram, and Facebook, and I believe LinkedIn and YouTube. You talk just briefly before we go about the importance of being a social media warrior for Israel.
It is important. Absolutely. I wish it were otherwise, but as someone who, is basically a Luddite and would not like to have any of that stuff, it is important. I would not be on Twitter if I didn't have to be on Twitter, or X as it is now. This is how a lot of people get their news. It's how a lot of journalists get their news. And there's good things about that, and there's bad things about that. You are exposed to, maybe sometimes you're exposed to a wider variety of views, but you get views of, say, someone who is maybe just an analyst based in Pakistan that doesn't have any sort of connection to some newspaper that you wouldn't otherwise get. Similar in that sense to Substack. But then, of course, there are some significant downsides, especially in our news cycle today, where it's not even a 24-hour news cycle. Things are just churning and burning. So it's easier to get disinformation out there. But it is if you're a journalist and you're not on X, I don't know how you're a journalist. It's, I
Right.
hate that that's the case, but that's reality.
Yeah. All right. So with that, I'd like to apologize for those of you who asked very good questions who we didn't have time to answer because there were a lot of great questions, which shows that there's a lot of interest in the topic that Sean presented. And I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in and just remind you that, especially since October 7th, the problem that camera is trying to fight has become worse. The atrocities of October 7th and its aftermath have really brought home the importance of Camera's mission, and we depend on the support of people who support our mission. So please go to camera.org, and if you can afford to do so, please donate. And with that, I'd like to again thank everyone for tuning in, and have a good day. Bye.